The sea that night was not the sea I had known in boyhood, no. Shimmering expanse kissed by Devon sun. No rhythmic lull of tide against the wooden jetty, where I once watched my father haul nets heavy with mackerel. This sea was ironclad and whispering, a vast oil-slicked throat-swallowing starlight, its breath thick with the reek of diesel, wet wool, and the acrid temps of fear too tightly coiled to be named. HMAS Bihilan, a modified river-class frigate, pitched and groaned beneath my boots, as if in reluctant obeisance to the North Atlantic Escole Dominion. I stood on the bridge, gloved hands gripping the rail until my knuckles ached, eyes fixed on the horizon where the convoy HX-274, 53 merchantmen, and 8 escorts stretched out, like a wounded serpent, across the gloom. Their running lights dimmed to the barest flicker, permitted by Admiralty Order 390 to 43rds. Blackout. Protocol in U-boat sectors above 50N. The air vibrated with the low thrum of twin reciprocating steam engines below. Comforting rhythm once. Now a metronome counting down to something I could not name, but felt in my marrow. It was March 1944, and the Battle of the Atlantic had sharpened into something colder, more precise than the chaotic slaughter of 42. The wolf packs had adapted. So had we. Huffduff. Triangulation. Improved Aztec sweeps. HFD. F-bearing fixes accurate to within 5 degrees. Only the sea gave us stillness long enough to use them. But tonight, the wind howled through the mast, rigging like a banshee denied its due, and the waves slapped the hull with a sound like wet canvas tearing. I had received the signal 3 hours prior, decrypted in the cramped, lamplit radio room below decks, the scent of hot bake-light and ozone clinging to the operator's uniform. It came not from Weston Approach's command, but from Combined Operations H. General Thorne aboard SS Maritza Se Envoy. HX 274 pios. Approx. 5,218 feet N. 3,345 feet W. Transporting priority alpha material. All escorts. Maintain absolute perimeter integrity. If compromise suspected, scuttle protocol delta applies. Acknowledge. No elaboration. No explanation. Just those words, typed on thin Admiralty paper, smelling faintly of damp and carbolic soap. Thorne. The name stirred something old and buried a memory of Sandhurst, 1931. A gaunt man in a perfectly pressed uniform. Eyes like flint, who once halted an entire drill square because a cadet's buttons gleamed too brightly in the sun. He had called it vanity. I had called it pride. He outranked me then, as it did know, though God knew what a general was doing aboard a rust-bucket Liberty ship in midwinter, carrying priority alpha cargo that warranted scuttling rather than capture. The very notion made my stomach knot. Scuttle Protocol Delta meant opening the seacocks, arming depth charges on deck, and abandoning ship with no survivors permitted within half a mile. It meant choosing the mission over men, over breath, over prayer, over the desperate clutch of a drowning hand. I had sent the acknowledgement vigilant copy out, but the word wait lingered in my mind like a misfired shell, because that's what he'd said. According to the Maritz's captain, when I'd hailed them on TBS an hour later, voice crackling through static telecommander IS Mare. The general's last word was wait. Last word. He was dead. Then, or dying. And yet, no distress. No U-boat sighting. No explosion. Just silence. And that single, suspended syllable hanging in the ether like a dropped stitch in the fabric of command. I descended to the chart room, the brass-bound door creaking on its hinges. The glow of the dim red battle lantern cast long shadows over the Mercator projection pinned to the bulkhead oar course. The convoy's zigzag pattern, the estimated U-boat patrol lines marked in cautious pencil. Lieutenant Parnell stood over the astute console, his face pale under the greenish cathode light, headphones clamped to his ears. "Still nothing, sir," he murmured, without looking up. Just the usual biologics, and the convoy's own prop wash. But I knew. You learn to feel its so unnatural stillness before the strike, the way the wind drops for a heartbeat, the sudden absence of gulls. It wasn't logic. It was the same instinct that had kept my father's boat from foundering in the 37 gale. I walked to the starboard wing of the bridge, the cold biting through my oilskin. Far astern, the Maritza rode low in the water, her silhouette blurred by mist. No lights, no movement on deck. And yet, something shifted. Not a wave, not a shadow, a displacement, a ripple where there should be none. "Parnell!" I called, voice low but edged, full Aztec sweep, bearing 220. Increase gain by 3 knots, and get me the Admiralty frequency clean channel, cipher priority. "Aye, sir." He moved quickly, but I saw his fingers tremble as he adjusted the knobs. We were all trembling, though none would admit it. Not with able Seaman Jenkins standing watch just behind me. Not with the Royal Marine liaison. Office unreadable, leaning against the chartroom bulkhead like a statue carved from ice. Minutes stretched. The sea hissed. The engines throbbed. And then a sound. Faint, metallic. The creak of a hatch being opened underwater. Or perhaps just my imagination, frayed by fatigue and the ghost of a general's final utterance. But imagination doesn't register on "Contact!" Parnell's voice cracked, bearing 218, range 900 yards. Closing fast. Doppler shift indicates submerged propulsion type VIIC. I'd wager. Speed 12 knots. My blood turned to frost. 12 knots. Enough to position for a spread of G7E torpedoes before we could even swing the guns to bear. The Maritza carried 1,600 souls, merchant crew, military personnel, perhaps even civilians. And inside her hold, Priority Alpha. Whatever that was. Documents, weapons, a scientist. The Marine liaison stepped forward. "Orders! Commander!" I looked at him, his cap badge gleaming dully, his eyes devoid of question, only expectation. He knew what Delta meant. They all did. But Thorne had said, "Wait." Why? Because he knew they were coming. Because he believed we could stop them without sacrificing the ship. Or because he'd changed his mind. Aboard the Maritza, a light flickered once on. The bridge wing, not a signal lamp, whoosed a much flaring briefly, as someone lit a cigarette. A human gesture. A breath in the void. And in that instant, I understood. The general hadn't been giving an order. He'd been pleading. But the Admiralty doesn't traffic in pleas, and U-boats don't honor hesitation. "Sound general quarters," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my ribs. "Prepare Hedgehog barrage, bearing 208, Signet all escort screen pattern Zulu. And send this to Weston. Approaches suspected. U-864 or sister boat in sector Convoy. Request air cover at dawn." The bosun's whistle shrieked into the night, sharp as a blade. Men scrambled from mess decks, boots pounding on steel grating. The sea, indifferent, rolled on, and I stood there, caught between a dead man's whisper and the roar of war, knowing that whichever choice I made, I would carry its weight until the sea claimed me, too. Dawn came not with light, but with a slow leaching of darkness, a grudging seep of pewter grey along the eastern rim of the world, as though the sky itself were reluctant to witness what unfolded beneath it. The Hedgehog barrage had erupted an hour before, its spindly projectiles arching into the black like iron thistles, detonating with muffled thunder against the ocean's skin. We'd heard nothing after the last explosion. No rending of pressure hulls, no gurgle of a dying submersible, only the ceaseless hiss of the swell reclaiming its silence. Whether we'd struck true or merely startled the predator into deeper shadow, I could not say. But the Maritza still floated, untouched at least by torpedoes, and that in itself felt like a kind of reprieve, however elusive. I descended to the wardroom not to rest, but to stare at the cipher machine. Its rotors inert, its keys cold. The liaison officer, Captain Mallory, I'd learned his name, stood by the porthole, mug of tea forgotten in his hand. Steam curled from its rim. condensing on the glass in ghostly trails. "You didn't scuttle," he said, not as accusation, but as observation, the words flat, drained of judgment. "No," I replied. "I waited." He turned then, and for the first time I saw something flicker in his eyes, not disapproval, but a kind of weary recognition. Thorne was carrying the microfilmed schematics of Operation Overlord's artificial harbors Mulberry A and B, not just locations. Load tolerances, title, anchoring sequences. Enough for Rommel to turn Gold and Juno beaches into charnel houses before the first landing craft grounded. The weight of it settled over me like a sodden greatcoat. Not weapons, not scientists. Blueprints. The quiet architecture of invasion, rendered in ink and acetate, and in the wrong hands, enough to drown Dday in blood before it began. "Then why did he say, 'Wait'?" I asked, my voice barely above the creak of the ship's timbers. Mallory exhaled slowly. "Because he knew the U-boat wasn't after the cargo." He paused, glancing toward the deck above, as if the answer lay suspended in the rigging. "It was after him." Abwehr had a source inside Combined Ops. Not high-rankingist, a cipher clerk with debts and a mistress in Lisbon. They knew Thorne would be on HX-274. They'd been tracking him since Falmouth. The U-boat wasn't hunting a convoy, it was hunting a man. And Thorne, he'd realized it too late. He'd sent a last-minute signal requesting delay, hoping we'd hold position. Draw the Wolf away from the Maritza, long enough for Coastal Command to arrive at first light. But the signal never reached western approaches. Interference. Interference or sabotage. I stared at him, the implications coiling tight in my chest. Thorne hadn't been pleading for his life. He'd been trying to lure the U-boat into the open, sacrificing himself to protect the invasion plans by becoming bait. And we, Abwehr Protocol, had nearly scuttled the very vessel he'd tried to shield. Outside, the light strengthened, the mist thinned, and there, on the horizon, 3 dots resolving into form. Their twin-engine drone cutting through the morning like a promise kept too late. I climbed back to the bridge. The convoy held formation, steaming eastward with dogged resolve. On the Maritza's deck, figures moved, now men coiling lines, checking hatches, life asserting itself against the void. But my eyes were drawn aft, where the sea lay smooth and unbroken. No periscope, no oil slick. Only the slow, patient roll of swells. Parnell approached, his face drawn. "Asdic's clean, sir. No contact for 2 hours. Either we got him, or he's gone to ground. Or he's waiting," I said, because that was the nature of this war, not in grand charges or blazoned skies, but in the suspended breath between choices, in the silence after a general's last word. The U-boat commander, if he still lived, would know the air cover was coming. He'd dive deep, run silent on electric motors, conserve his batteries, and wait for another night, another convoy, another chance. The sea offered infinite patience to those willing to drown in it. I gave the order to resume standard screening pattern-wide, vigilant, but no longer frantic. We'd shepherded HX-274 past the danger arc. The worst was over, and yet, as the sun finally broke the cloud line, casting long golden fingers across the water, I felt no relief, only the dull ache of understanding. Thorne had known what we all refused to name, that in war, the purest courage often looks like hesitation. That too, wait, truly wait, against every instinct for action, is sometimes the most decisive act of all. He had gambled his life on the hope that someone would understand the weight of that single word, and though I had not grasped it in time, I carried it now like a talisman, worn smooth by regret. Days later, in the Admiralty debriefing room, wood-paneled, smelling of pipe tobacco and starched collars, they commended my prudent judgment in withholding scuttle protocol. No mention was made of Thorne's final signal, no inquiry into the cipher failure. The wheels of command ground on, indifferent to the human tremors that rattled its axles. I returned to sea within the week. Another convoy, another stretch of iron water. But every time the Aztec pinged into the depths, every time the wind dropped to that eerie hush, I heard it again, not as command, not as plea, but as echo. Wait. And sometimes, in the quietest watches of the night, I did, not because I believed it would change the outcome, but because someone had died trusting that it might, and in that act of waiting futile, fragile, humane, I honored him more than any medal ever could. The sea remembers nothing, but I do, and that, perhaps, is the only memorial the drowned ever receive.